Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive in again? You know we love to get into the nitty-gritty of some fascinating research, and today is no different. We're tackling the teenage brain, specifically how it learns best. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, not gonna lie, being a parent myself and seeing those teenage years firsthand. So listeners, if you've ever wondered what's going on inside the minds of those teenagers in your life, buckle up, because this deep dive is for you. You know how it seems like teenagers are capable of so much, learning new skills, soaking up information like sponges, and yet sometimes it's like their brains are still catching up with their bodies.
Oh, tell me about it. I think we've all been there. But actually, that's a pretty good analogy for what's happening in the adolescent brain. Think of it like this. It's a major city undergoing a massive renovation. You've got construction zones everywhere, detours, streets being rerouted. It's a work in progress, but the potential is incredible.
Okay, I like that analogy. So we're talking about a brain that's under construction, lots of potential, but maybe a little messy and disorganized in the meantime.
Precisely. And one of the most important things happening during this renovation is something called synaptic pruning.
Synaptic pruning. I've heard that term before, but I'll be honest, I need a little refresher. What exactly does it mean?
Sure. So our brains are constantly forming connections between brain cells. These connections are called synapses, and they're how we learn and process information. But as we grow up, especially during adolescence, our brains start to realize, hey, some of these connections are more important than others. And that's where synaptic pruning comes in. The brain starts to prune away the connections that aren't being used as much, kind of like trimming back the branches of a tree to make it stronger and more efficient.
So it's like decluttering our brains, getting rid of the stuff we don't really need anymore.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that this pruning process actually leads to a decrease in what's called gray matter in the brain.
Wait a minute, decrease, that doesn't sound like a good thing. Isn't more gray matter better?
You'd think so, right? But in this case, it's actually a sign that the brain is becoming more efficient. Think of it like this. You've got a computer with tons of old files and programs you never use anymore. They're just taking up space and slowing things down. So you do a little digital decluttering, you delete all that unnecessary stuff.
I know that feeling. My computer runs so much faster after I do that.
Exactly. And it's the same thing with the brain. By getting rid of those unused connections, the brain actually becomes faster and more efficient at processing information.
That's incredible. So as teenagers are learning and having new experiences, their brains are essentially rewiring themselves, strengthening the connections that matter most.
Exactly. And that's why this stage of life is so important for brain development. The experiences teenagers have during this time, their interactions, their challenges, their passions, all of these things literally shape the architecture of their brains.
It's like their experiences are the architects, designing the blueprint for the adults they'll become.
I like that the experiences are the architects. That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've got this brain that's like a city under construction, getting rid of old connections, building new ones sounds pretty intense. But then we add another layer to the mix, and that's, of course, those famous teenage hormones, right?
Exactly. And we're not just talking about physical changes here. These hormones have a profound impact on brain development and behavior. It's like adding fuel to the fire of an already dynamic process.
Okay, so walk me through this. What's the connection between hormones and, say, those classic teenage mood swings, or their tendency to be impulsive?
Well, think about it this way. You've got these hormones like dopamine and adrenaline surging through the teenage brain. These are the feel-good hormones, the ones that give us that rush of excitement, that sense of reward.
And teenagers are experiencing these hormonal surges, like, all the time, right?
Pretty much. And their brains are wired to crave those dopamine hits, those exciting experiences. It helps explain why teenagers might be drawn to new and novel activities, even if they seem a little risky to us adults.
So that desire to try new things, to push the boundaries, it's not just them being rebellious for the sake of it.
Not necessarily. It's their brains seeking out those rewarding experiences, those dopamine rushes. But here's the thing. Remember how we were talking about the prefrontal cortex still being under construction during adolescence?
Yeah, the part of the brain that's responsible for judgment, planning, impulse control, all that good stuff.
Right. Well, that part of the brain is still playing catch-up while those hormones are surging. It's like having a powerful sports car with a still developing braking system.
A recipe for some interesting moments behind the wheel.
You could say that, and that's why teenagers might struggle with things like thinking through consequences, planning for the future, or even just regulating their emotions. Their brains are still figuring out how to balance those powerful impulses with logic and reason.
It's like they have one foot in childhood and one foot in adulthood.
Ah.
And speaking of things that can have a big impact during this crucial time of brain development, we have to talk about the role of technology.
Yeah, and we can't talk about the teenage brain these days without talking about the impact of technology, right? Smartphones, social media, the internet, it's all pervasive.
It really is. It's like a whole other layer of input shaping these developing brains, and it's definitely something researchers are trying to wrap their heads around.
It makes you wonder, like, back in the day, we could just tell kids to go outside and play, get off the screens. But for teenagers today, it's not so simple, is it? Their social lives, their learning, so much of it is intertwined with technology. Absolutely, and that's where we get into this idea of digital natives. Teenagers today have literally grown up with this technology. It's been there from the start. So their brains are wired differently compared to those of us who adopted it later in life.
So are you saying their brains are actually physically different?
Well, we know that the brain is constantly rewiring itself based on our experiences, right? So imagine the impact of spending hours every day interacting with screens, processing information from multiple sources at once. There are going to be changes in brain structure and function.
Okay, so how do we even begin to study that? It seems almost impossible to separate the digital from the real these days.
It is a challenge, for sure, but researchers are finding ways. And the research you sent us had some really interesting studies looking at this very thing.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
Well, one study found that even just 1 week of internet use led to measurable changes in brain activity in older adults who weren't really used to using the internet.
Wow, just 1 week. That's wild.
Right. Imagine the impact then on teenagers who are using technology for hours every single day, often multitasking across different platforms. It's like their brains are constantly being bombarded with stimulation.
Okay, so that sounds kind of intense.
Yeah.
But is it necessarily a bad thing? I mean, technology isn't all bad, right? There are definitely some positives.
Absolutely. And that's the key here. It's not about demonizing technology. It's about finding a healthy balance. And it's about understanding the potential impact, both positive and negative, that this much digital engagement can have on these still developing brains.
So what's the takeaway here for parents, educators, anyone who's raising or working with teenagers in this digital age? What do we need to keep in mind?
Well, first of all, I think it's about recognizing that this is the world they're growing up in. We can't just shut off the technology, and honestly, we wouldn't want to. There's so much potential there. But we do need to be mindful of creating healthy boundaries around technology use.
Right. It's about teaching those digital literacy skills early on, right? Like how to be a critical consumer of information, how to protect your privacy, how to balance online and offline interactions.
Exactly. And it's also about encouraging activities that help develop those other crucial skills that might be getting less attention in a digitally saturated world. Things like focus, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, and, those old-fashioned things like face-to-face communication, empathy, building real-world relationships.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Embracing the incredible opportunities that technology offers while also nurturing those core human skills that are always going to be essential, no matter how technologically advanced our world becomes.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, there you have it, listeners. Another deep dive done and dusted. We've explored the incredible world of the teenage brain, those constant construction zones, those hormone surges, and of course the impact of growing up in a world that's more digitally connected than ever before. It's a lot to process, but we hope you found it as fascinating as we have. Until next time, keep those curious minds engaged and remember the journey of learning and discovery never really ends, even when those teenage years are long gone. See you next time.